嘢。
Hey, I'm McKinnon-Little, an editor at Tech Magazine. I'm joined today by Naz to talk about Robert Bresson's A Man Escapes, which is this kind of it's a film made in, I think it's 1956, which is based on the memoirs of André Devigny or Devigny, I'm not quite sure. Devigny. Thank you. It's always good to have a team.
I wasn't sure though.
I'm just like pretending like I didn't Google that before and like write down a little pronunciation.
I read it in my head, so.
And anyway, so what this so-called Devigny talks about in his memoir is his escape from a Nazi prison camp as a member of the French resistance, which Bresson himself was also locked up in a prison camp for I think about, I think it was 18 months or so. So there's a kind of like he's drawing on his own experience in some sense as well in his adaptation of this story. Yeah, I don't know if you want to kind of lead with any sort of like, I should say as well that the character in the film is Fontaine, who's this kind of, I guess, like hybrid figure of like both these people, who has been locked up in this prison after being caught in his attempts to sabotage the war effort, blowing up a bridge. And the film begins with him kind of like being driven to this prison, and he makes a break for it and they catch him and he gets taken in. And then, yeah, the rest of it kind of just unfolds in his cell as he kind of meticulously plots his escape with a kind of looming threat of execution. I don't know if you want to sort of speak to the impressions, Naz.
I don't know if you like felt the same way as I did, but at the beginning I actually found it quite funny. Like there was something quite comic. I think I didn't know what to expect, so I found like he was very expressionless. Fontaine was quite like deadpan. His movements were so deliberate. Everything was well thought out, very rational. And he would narrate the story and say, I cried or I was sad, but you couldn't see that expression on his face. So at first I was kind of taken aback because I was expecting more of a, I don't know, the war movies I expect, or the prison break, you know, Shawshank Redemption and 1917 blockbuster. I was imagining something like that. And it was so scaled back that I kind of thought, I found myself laughing a lot in the beginning. But yeah, did you find it at all comic?
I think there's a comedy to it as well, insofar as there is that like weird delinking. And I think there's one scene in particular where he kind of like, there's the narrator going like, oh, I kind of like, as I finally like returned to my room and like knew that I still had some time to escape and wasn't going to be taken, you know, by the firing squad now, and I still had this like window of opportunity, like I laughed with like a strange relief, and he just makes this absolutely like ridiculous noise as he like plummets into his bed.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah. But I think the film's nice about that insofar as it doesn't like, there's stuff which is still uncertain, kind of impenetrable about the characters, and I think it kind of has the effect of like who you are as the viewer, who you are as a viewer is someone who's perhaps like, you know, sort of in the cell beside him or kind of like going through this experience alongside Fontaine, rather than it being like, oh, this is this kind of like dramatization of what it feels like to like be this person in this time and space. There's a kind of like distance that you have to navigate. And makes me think of the way all the prisoners kind of, whenever they devise an escape plan, they'll like write it down on a little piece of paper and make sure it gets passed to someone before they kind of attempt it. So there's some sort of record or connection. I think the film's kind of about that like weird process of trying to like negotiate that.
Yeah, it
the
did
other
feel like we were right there with him, like in that prison cell, looking up at the lantern frame, seeing like how meticulous he was about opening the door and the
mm,
boards. And, you know, he went back with the pencil to make sure you couldn't see anything that was like tampered with. I really like those little details and the whole escape plan as well. But yeah, it was just so, I don't know, I kept waiting for something like bad to happen, or for, you know, at the towards the
mm,
end when he gets a new cellmate, was it Just,
yeah,
I think his name was, yeah. I kept thinking, okay, this boy is just going to ruin the plan. He's going to make some loud noise, he's going to fall when they're climbing down the rope. And I think maybe I'm just kind of used to Hollywood movies and that kind of dramatization, but you know, that never happened, which I quite liked. It
yeah,
stayed very level-headed the entire time because Fontaine, you know, really planned it out well.
yeah. There's kind of very little in the way of plot in the whole movie, really. It's just kind
Mm.
of, I was thinking about the kind of the comedy of it as well as that it's just this kind of like mechanism that kind of gets wound up and then just like progresses to its end. And there's the only one outcome, which is that he escapes the prison. And you obviously know this at the beginning because it's kind of an adaptation of his memoirs. And there's a sense of like inevitability. And it's this sense of like a process just being like left to unfold. And you're there to kind of witness that. And there's no sort of dramatization, which I think comes through in that like meticulous attention to like the way he like carefully arranges objects and like handles things, and this kind of zeroing in on these like very particular details, and also the sense of sound in the film where like there's this kind of, you have this sense of like the repeated activity of like what it is like be in the cell and plot your escape, and like listening for the guard and going through the people, and it kind of, it doesn't, it sort of stays at that level of like gesture and kind of like repeated activity rather than trying to like frame it into this like heroic narrative, which I think is interesting because the film is kind of like, um, I think there's a conversation they have. There's a sort of washing room, which is the kind of space where the prisoners have a chance to sort of talk to each other in hushed tones and kind of exchange messages and so on. And um, there's a rumor that kind of Fontaine's file isn't looking so good, and if he wants to get, you know, escape the prison, he should sort of get on with it. And there's a conversation between two of the other prisoners where they say something to the effect of like, um, you know, you can't change fate, and then the one says something along the lines of, but he can, or something. And I think the film is kind of about that tension of like freedom and like the way circumstances can kind of like condemn you to things or shape you by things. Um, and yeah, because I
Yeah.
think that kind of comes through. There's two areas where like I sort of appreciated it. One is where to get out of this prison, he has to pay like meticulous attention to like the sort of the schedules of the guards, you know, the timing of their walking, and what kind of makes them vulnerable is this like mechanicity of their motions. So they're not there. There isn't like a sense of like freedom or possibility or how you might like steer life in you because you're just like trapped in this thing, and that kind of is the window that allows them to get out.
Yeah.
Um, but then
Yeah.
also they have to like do this thing at the end where, you know, to kind of enact that plan is to kind of commit yourself to a level of like uncertainty and vulnerability. And he says that I'm like, I don't know if this is quite going to work out, but
Yeah.
and I
I
don't know
actually
if I
quite
can trust
liked.
this strange boy who's just been placed in my cell, who's talking
Mm.
about how like, oh, I had no choice, I just joined the army because I was like 16 and whatever, and like, and that thing of like, I have no choice, do I have a choice, is like kind of, and I feel like I'm going about it in a very rambly way, but I think that's kind of central to the whole film, and kind of
I know
like,
what you mean. I actually
yeah,
quite liked, you know, once a wrench was kind of thrown into his plans, which was Just, was kind of seeing that in uncertainty because, you know, as we were saying, everything was meticulously planned out. He seems, Fontaine's very like confident in his statements, even earlier with at that washroom, he was saying, I think a new prisoner joined and his wife had betrayed him. And Fontaine was so to the point, like, did you kill her? Her life is worth nothing now, which kind of made me laugh. He was just very
yeah,
decisive. Um, yeah, so towards the end, when he was uncertain and you saw him hesitate to climb that rope, I think, you start to see what he's kind of reckoning with, whether he should believe in this kid or leave him aside. And you do see that Fontaine's very trusting, even with passing the notes to all the other prisoners, and the other prisoners were saying, he talks too much. So I liked seeing the flaws come out in his personality, and just like, he is also a real person, not just a lieutenant who knows what he's doing.
Yeah, and I think you kind of, in most distinct terms, sort of like express what I was trying to get at, where there is that final scene where he's kind of made it all the way, about to escape, and he now has to kind of make this decision. He's managed to throw this kind of rope across two walls, which will allow him, if he can make it past and the guard doesn't see him, to get out of the prison. And I think the point I was trying to get to earlier is like the tension that kind of animates the film is like this desire for freedom, but then in order to achieve that freedom, you have to like commit yourself to like, you have to like make a decision which limits your freedom. So you have to trust this person. Like, we've like made a promise, we're obliged to each other. There's something which is like beyond ourselves, which we've committed to, which we have to like do now. And we just have to
taking the risk, taking that plunge, which was like literally as well, to go across between the two buildings. That scene also was funny to me just because of the guard on the bicycle, just as a side note. Like, he was just doing the rounds. I just thought that was really hilarious.
And it makes this kind of ridiculous like creaking noise.
Yeah, and what you were saying about sounds is so true. Just, you would hear the sound of the trains, you would hear the gunshots, you would never actually see anyone get shot. You didn't see violence that you would normally associate with a war movie. The guards were very polite, almost. Like, I was surprised at the level of surveillance. When they were doing the rounds and asking, do you have a pencil? Fontaine's just like, no, and that was it. I think that was really surprising to me as well. Just the treatment of the...
It almost, it sort of feels like a sort of like this good sportsmanship almost of like, like, you don't want to
take your word for it.
Exactly,
You don't? Okay, great. Yeah. But I actually, you mentioned the ending earlier. I don't know if it's just me expecting the worst, like, they're not going to escape and something is going to happen. But when they walked away and, they're walking kind of slow, fast, trying not to draw any attention, then I was like, aha, the movie is called A Man Escaped. And it sounds so silly, but after watching the whole movie and seeing how straightforward and deliberate it is, and Bresson doesn't, give you any shock value or entertainment value, it just made sense for me. It came full circle. It was like, well, I knew from the beginning, essentially, that he escapes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm still like on my toes. Like, he still managed to kind of like hook me in, and I couldn't take my eyes off it.
Yeah, it's strangely transfixing. I think it's sort of the way, I think, because of all the weird repetition in the film, you kind of like, you zero in the same way that like, it's almost as if, if you're like working or something and then you start hearing like a sort of like pipe dripping in another room, and your attention does this weird thing where it just like zooms into that detail, and it becomes like really omnipresent. And I imagine if you're stuck in a Nazi war camp, there's ample opportunities for that to happen, and the film really does that, where it's just a slow kind of like deep immersion in this very limited kind of sensory space where like nothing happens outside the cell. There's just these kind of like noises and like these hints of activity, but they're really intrusive and kind of intense when you do hear them. Like, if the guard walking past is like really loud and like that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you can't help but hone in on them, and it ends up being like, it's like a soundscape, and you can figure out movements and how to plan, in his case, his escape. And he would look across the room through the peephole, and his the fellow prisoner was also making sounds to alert him to a guard coming up the stairs. But yeah, you can't help but hone in on just such simple sounds.
Yeah, but I think also what you're just saying now about that thing of like the way that the prisoners will kind of collaborate and like help each other is quite interesting as well, because like you're mentioning at the beginning the kind of the comedy of it, and it's maybe a good thing to sort of pull it back to sort of like round off a bit, is that all of these people have this like weird, the film's quite distant, as we've been saying, where there's no kind of melodrama, there's no sense of like emotional intensity or kind of like kind of I guess like the idea of an escape film is that it's pure like kind of like cinematic like tension and release and whatever, and this is just the opposite of that. Um, is that it doesn't seem like it's this kind of noble quest that he's pursuing. He's just kind of like, well, these are the circumstances, and this is like what I can do, and this is how I'm going to like try do this thing, and then this is what kind of like weird distance to the whole endeavor. And I think you see that in the like the kind of the conversations and the sort of provisional bonds that are established throughout the movie. And I don't know, I just really like that. I think there's a sense of like the kind of this kind of cunning tactile knowledge that allows you to kind of like get on with other people and get on in the world. Yeah. It isn't like presented as this kind of like grand redeeming like quest for like the good or something. But just
I like that as well. You know, the prisoners were kind of just urging him to do it. They said, you know, now's the time, stop hesitating. But it wasn't in a way that he was going to free everyone else in the prison and he's like some hero who's come to save us all. I like how it was just, oh, you kind of want to do this, you've got a plan, okay, go.
Yeah.
You know? And they helped him along the way, but it didn't seem like a big deal at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me think of, so the boy who comes into his room at the end just says this thing where Fontaine's kind of like quizzing him a bit and trying to work out who he is and whether he can be trusted and so on and so forth. And he talks about how he left home and like joined the army just like to do something. And I think the whole film is kind of animated by that sense of like, well, you just have to do something. Like you just have to like,
just anything.
You know, you have to like act and there's a world going on, you have to respond in some way and you have to try and navigate and survive. And sometimes that looks like a noble quest for redemption, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think, it's about the weird tension of trying to navigate that. I think as a final thought, which I think is quite interesting, is that there's this, which I think circles back to the comedy, but there's this philosopher, Henry Bergson, who has this theory of comedy, that comedy happens when, you know, we get too caught up in the mechanicity of our sort of like movements or maps of the world to like notice what's really going on around it. So if we have like a pre-planned like way that we're going to walk from X to Z, X to whatever, and we're not paying attention to the world around us, you're not going to see the banana peel. And the comedy of someone slipping in a banana peel is there's this unaccounted for variable. And I think this film's basically like, I think that's what makes this a weirdly comedic film, is that there's this constant like all these unaccounted for variables that you can somehow like kind of bring together to create this plan to like do this thing. And if the guards only are walking in these ways at these times, then you might be able to slip out. And it depends, like there's always uncertainty in that. And I think it kind of finds something quite reassuring in that uncertainty. As much as it's a source of kind of terror, it's also about kind of leaning into that and like making a pact with this person you can't really trust necessarily to try to find.
And it comes down to like making a choice, trust this person. And in the end, he actually needed Just. So you could say that he made the right choice, because at one point he says, if Just wasn't here, I wouldn't have been able to climb up the wall. So it was, you know, kind of taking a leap of faith. He was sounding him out, but it just came down to making a choice and whether to trust him or not. But yeah, I think it's a good place to end it.
Fantastic. Cool. Thanks for chatting.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.